Hi, everyone. This is Lauren. Welcome to my presentation today. I'm really excited to deliver this to you. The topic that we will be looking into here is framing a healthy relationship with food using nutrition-focused language skills. I'm going to run through a couple of items here. Clearly, this is me. You can always look into me on my website, find out a little bit more about what I do and the book that I've published. It's really complementary to what we're talking about today. So no disclosures, and then we've got a lot of slides, content. If you've been with me before and seen my presentations, you know that I like to give you a lot of information, a lot of things to think about, and I try to be thought-provoking. So that's what we're going to do, and we are going to dive straight in, looking at our language skills, a history of nutrition, a couple of patient stories, including a case study that's really powerful. So I hope that you enjoy this little journey with me, have a lot to think about, and I'm always here afterwards if you have questions and want to talk a bit more. So today, we will examine communication and emotions through the eyes of the patient with a focus on nutrition. So we're going to do quite a bit. Language skills, a means of communicating ideas. Are we born communicators? This is the question I want to begin with you. Do we acquire skills through passive exposure? Just something to think about. How do we get good at talking to people? Now, research looks at training as mostly observational, lecture and reflection through case studies. I'm sure you can imagine your training in the very beginning of what you practice if you're a nurse or a dietitian. Lacks deliberate practice in the development of coaching skills. So subjective patient interpretation. And we also can observe just in the recall of what patients might be learning that there are gaps between what clinicians say and how words are received. Really, we learn to communicate on the job. We get better by practicing the actual skill that we're trying to improve when it comes to language. Communication and delivery. Suboptimal communication skills likely contribute to clinician burnout, something that research is finding. Quite interesting here, this 2020 study of investigating physician skills and risk of burnout. Something called Breaking Bad News. This was a report by physicians that were surveyed. And interestingly, these were the bullet points that really jumped out at me. Balancing hope with honesty was one of the most difficult parts of communication, and dealing with patients' emotions, so emotional health. That's why we're going to go a little deeper, a lot deeper actually, into talking about emotional health of people with diabetes today. The research also found that clinician competence in communication skills is variable. Just because you have the training doesn't mean you're all equally the same at delivering it. And communication skills do not always improve with time or experience, but I do find interesting because if we're learning on the job, why aren't we necessarily improving just naturally through that practice? Well, it has to do with the quality of how we are communicating. And attending to the emotional health of patients, it's not widely recognized, although I can tell you, it is always in the room with you. If you're talking with someone with diabetes, the emotions are absolutely there. As a person with type 1 diabetes, that's also what I'm going to emphasize today, is how to think about emotional health underneath all of the data that we might be talking about, or the glucose interpretation that we're typically doing. So the emotional depth of diabetes, here we go. So people with diabetes and the consequences of pessimism, hypercriticism, comparing ourselves to others, look at how impactful this can be. We're critical on ourselves. We're feeling pessimistic about our care. There's a decline, physical, mental health at risk, leading into high rates of depression, anxiety, and burnout, that disordered relationship with food that can really carry with all of these other emotional feelings that we have. Medication avoidance, of course, it's isolation, feeling understood. So the range of feelings I want you to look at here, clearly that emotional depth has to be in the room with us when we have these conversations. So if we do have clinicians that are avoiding addressing emotions because it's not a comfortable space, it's going to really lead into the diabetes care and education specialists seeing a huge opportunity here and helping someone improve their self-care. Those range of feelings, the ones that I tend to focus on that I think are quite important because they relate to many others, is obsession with control. As we're looking at time and range, we're talking about it a lot, right? We're looking at glucose values and what our CGMs can give us for evidence all times of the day, but then perfectionism, that self-worth tied to our numbers, and failure. This is a bit of a cycle where then depression and anxiety all can come together. So emotions are always there. Research on emotions. This is something I found incredibly interesting. I really couldn't wait to share this with my peers. This article looks at the neural basis of fear, promotes anger and sadness, counteracts anger. What they did is they used movie clips to provoke an emotion, and then they observed neural activity from those emotions, and they found that fear promotes anger. I have a real interest in studies about anger. I think that's something that is really underlying a lot of people's reactions who live with diabetes 24/7. And they looked at fear closer within that neural activity. And fear can foster aggressive behavior, but sadness reduces aggressive behavior. So one emotion can lead to another, can be many emotions felt at one time. Joy counteracts sadness. And there's related neural activation between sadness, empathy, and sympathy. So many things going on. So thinking about that emotional depth of diabetes and how much can be going on just in the course of 24 hours. And I love this graphic to show the frustration of what can happen in the middle of the night when someone who's tracking their blood sugar might be waking up to this high that randomly happens in the middle of the night when you went to bed in range or you didn't have much movement going on, and boom, physiology starts to take over. It's very easy for someone, in this case with type 1 diabetes, to blame themselves, that hypercriticism, thinking it's my fault that this happened. What did I do wrong? And internalizing that, there's our isolation. There is that emotional reaction to data. So we know that it's there and it can be there all the time. A description of life with diabetes, here's a question mark. For the person living with diabetes, language impacts perception. So the way that we talk about this big group, glucose, insulin, nutrition, exercise, we're managing these things all the time, thinking about them all the time. So our brain, mental, and emotional health are underlying a lot of these thoughts. It's a part of the whole picture. It's a very holistic disease to live with. So words direct attitude. Now you can imagine that the way that we talk about diabetes as clinicians can play a huge role in the attitude that someone has about their lifestyle and the way that they continue forward in their experience with diabetes management. These questions I want to give to you here, really in that description of life with diabetes, is how might your words affect those newly diagnosed of any type of diabetes, but then the parents of those with type 1 and young adults, those growing up with diabetes now, type 2 diabetes in kids, it's a family affair. How might your words affect the people that are just finding out that diabetes is going to be something in their life? And are you sending fear-based messages? And I want to tie this back into words directing attitude. There are things here that I certainly continue to hear on a regular basis. And I don't just hear them from those that live with diabetes, but I do hear it from the medical community. Don't eat carbs, you're a diabetic, kind of an accusation type of a term, using fear to hopefully get a positive outcome. And maybe it's not met with negative intentions, but saying things like you are going to lose your vision if. Also, the labeling of diabetics are a certain thing. Again, even if it's not it's meant to be positive, it still can come across to people who are very impressionable about this. Remember, words direct attitude, language impacts perception. So one I do want to call out in particular is the word sucks. This seems to come a lot in diabetes. And personally, I'm not a fan of that. As someone with type 1, I don't want anyone trying to direct my attitude into thinking that diabetes is something that sucks, because certainly it's something that teaches me a lot about myself, my body, and how I can care for myself going forward. So that perception is really important. Not everyone has the ability to talk themselves into a more positive place, like I have just done when I think of words that may be interpreted as negative, to lead me into thinking that it's a negative thing to live with. Disconnects in communication. Where do these disconnects happen? In a review of literature, something that you can look at and you may start to pick out is the experience of young adults and older adults with diabetes, the attitudes and barriers to exercise. If you're looking at research talking about eating disorders and weight gain, there's a lot of emotion behind that. And then perspectives of providers, what they see in care, where they would like more help, where they think their patients would have better outcomes. The things that jumped out at me that can be disconnects in communication here is that sympathy versus empathy. That difference in saying, gosh, I know diabetes sucks, or by saying, gosh, tell me more about the difficult time that you're having. I want to know what it's like to walk in your shoes. Empathy is trying to get into someone's experience, but not trying to tell them what their experience is like. So misunderstandings of facts and distrust, conflicts in research, what one agrees over the other, There are missed opportunities in communication, things where a patient may be really throwing a softball at you about something they need help with and missing it. And then clinical priorities versus individual needs. There can be a clash within the exam room. And so I want to lead you to look at this little graphic here. Yes, it looks like a recycling symbol, and that's exactly how it kind of works, is the person with diabetes has their own experience and they're with themselves all the time versus the short period of time that they are with their care team. And the rational interpretation of data happens here. We're looking at glucose values, whether we're using a CGM, glucose monitor, an insulin pump, rational interpretation of what's happening here. There's always going to be an emotional reaction in the thought process of what am I going to do next now that I have this data before me. That emotional reaction leads into the diabetes experience as an influence. And once again, we've got interpretation, emotional reaction, experience. All of this is tied together. So in the greater world of diabetes, if emotional health is not being looked at or not being considered as something important or something that needs to be addressed while we are doing a teach, we're missing something incredible. We are missing the opportunity to understand someone's experience more in depth and perhaps target the root of what they're struggling with. So again, emotions, they are always there and they are worth talking about, or if we see them, we can pull them forward and talk about it. So experience and emotional health, let's go a little bit more in depth, and I'm going to throw a story in here. So we've got Tyler, who's 29. I know him well. He has given me permission to talk about who he is. He's shared his story publicly several times. And with Tyler, what we began to talk about in his experience with type 1 diabetes had to do with exercise and nutrition. He had some things to overcome there from what he had learned. So we came to time and range and realizing there was a lot of self-criticism behind that. He's also a dedicated cyclist. He's a husband and a new dad. He's got a lot going on in his life, and he's had diabetes for a long time, since he was 7. In the course of evaluating what his existence is like and experience with type 1, he knows he likes numbers. He's a goal-oriented person. And if he feels like glucose is getting into an area where it's just moving around too much and he's not making the healthiest decisions for himself, he'll set small goals to reset a bit. But he also has found that those numbers can determine his attitude, can really change the way that he thinks about his experience with diabetes, but how he treats other people around him who care. So reaching and maintaining time and range can be mentally challenging for him. This is that emotional depth of where it can go. So Tyler had said that relating to feeling out of control with his glucose, if it just gets away from him, he feels like a different person, scared, shameful, selfish, irresponsible, and even frustrated. I don't want attention when people try to help, and I'm rude about it. So self-reflection is really honest. He knows exactly what this looks like. He was particularly talking about hyperglycemia in this case. And what he found is that he doesn't like himself when his glucose is doing something that he can't get a hold of fast enough. So to target the source for solutions, this is what we looked at for Tyler, is to unpack what he was afraid of and the consequences of some of the actions he's taken to try to control it so much. And what we found out was that he was traumatized when he was young by threats of high blood sugar from an endocrinologist. This is quite common out there in the world of type 1 as well, is that even with good intentions, we have clinicians talking about the consequences of complications related to hyperglycemia over time. But depending on the delivery, the way that the words are used and the communication style to describe what it's like to have high blood sugar, this can be very frightening to think about for parents, for the person with diabetes. And what it led to for Tyler was anxiety. Thoughts about long-term complications were really overwhelming. So anytime he went out of range, he would get a bit nervous about this. And I can tell you, as an athlete, as a cyclist, out of range happens. It's how you react to it. It's going to be your method of self-care. So honesty, increased awareness of that rage bolus, that taking insulin and letting it stack because you're trying to control that high blood sugar so intensely that then you start chasing after low blood sugars. And this is exactly what Tyler's experience was, that he had to target and look for a solution as to how can we overcome this, because the emotions are really taking over at this point. Tyler had said, you feel like you aren't good enough or able to handle the tasks you've been given. And it's so sad that he feels this way as a result of a provider who made him feel ashamed for having high blood sugar. And this was when he was young. It wasn't every single time he was there, but it made a great enough impact that it carried on for many, many years afterwards. And as we looked at these fears and the consequences of them, Tyler realized that what he really, really needed was supportive care team. In addition to understanding his exercise and nutrition that was going to support the lifestyle he wanted, he needed that care team to help him feel better about who he was. Now he has a new endocrinologist. He describes as a great listener, and that endocrinologist recommends attainable goals. So Tyler said, I feel like he not only understands how hard it is, but is also proud of the work I put in, even if the numbers don't show. So the best thing for Tyler is realizing here's where my fears are, here's where they came from, and here's what I need in order to continue to have my best experience in diabetes management. So where emotional health is targeted, and we look for solutions in order to treat the whole person. So when self-worth is tied to data, this is what this can look like: a life of reactivity when you have diabetes. Coping is a skill set for daily practice, knowing what the person needs. And clearly, I'm talking to a group of clinicians here. We know how important self-care is when all of these stories of people's experiences collect in our hearts and in our souls, is that we need to self-care ourselves a lot too. It really is a very important daily practice for all of us. We are a care team around that person. We know what they need to be caring for themselves, but we also need to internalize a little bit of that too for ourselves in that coping. Focus often leans towards what is going wrong versus right. Time in range. Let's say someone is just under target. They're looking at 65% of time in range. That means more than half the time they're doing something right, but they tend to still really focus on what's not right, to be that 25% of the time. And so as clinicians, being able to recognize, are we only focusing on what's not really going right as well? Or are we also looking at two sides to this and saying, okay, how can we be optimistic about what we can do differently here, or where we want to go in order for you to feel more self-sufficient? So external messaging, internal forgiveness. The person with diabetes needs to be able to accept that not everything is going to be perfect. So we want to not use words like perfectionism or that diabetes is just impossible. Being as positive as we can, so that person tends to forgive themselves when things aren't always just right, because that is a life of diabetes. It is variable. It has a lot to do with adaptability. But rolling in range, it could be viewed as a roadmap of emotional health. Really, the fluctuations in blood sugar can cause all of these emotions to happen in the course of the same day, from happiness to feeling kind of bummed. But of course, as clinicians, what we know and the messaging that we give about time and range and data is that that flat line isn't the goal. 100% of the time, blood sugar does not need to be something that doesn't move, because it does. It's nature. It is physiology. Our blood sugar is going to roll. And that's okay. So how do we help someone forgive themselves when blood sugar starts to fluctuate, and then make good decisions in order to move forward in that emotional cycle of experience, interpreting data, and then emotions? The research on quality of life, more research here looking at emotions, factors that affect the quality of life in young adults with type 1. Now, there are 180 young adults to look at here, 18 to 35 years, all had type 1. Fear and worry were the dominant feelings that affected quality of life in this study. What people with diabetes were most concerned about was hypoglycemia and complications, but also interesting, they felt like a burden on their families. That created a difficult experience where quality of life was impacted. And also just having the time to manage, having a life to live, but then having diabetes woven into every decision that you make, every experience that you have. But they also found out, as self-efficacy increases, so does quality of life. So feeling like you know what you need and you can do what you need to do in order to keep your body in a place where you're healthy and confident. Here are my questions to you. Does emphasizing time and range contribute to fear and worry? How do we talk about time and range so that we stay positive, and as though our words will inspire someone to get there and do the best that they can, and that's okay? Also, how might encouraging very low A1C values impact quality of life? And I bring up this question because we know that there are more people living with diabetes who are not meeting the 7% goals for A1C than who are. But what people with diabetes will often see out there in social media and the public is incredible praise for being 100% in range, or for having an A1C value way lower than 7%. And just knowing that these messages can impact emotional health for so many people that may be struggling to reach that 7%, those clinicians, if we are aware that that messaging can get into somebody, and it may not always be helpful to say, well, a very low A1C is better, or you should try harder to get lower than 6.5, for example. Maybe someone is okay where they are. If they're meeting that 7% goal, that's what we're always trying to help them get towards. But could encouraging better impact quality of life? The evolution of nutrition. Now we're going to shift a little bit. We're going to look at our communication, particularly in nutrition, that could be impacting emotional health even more and where it came from. The timeline of nutrition and diabetes. Some of you may have seen this timeline with me before. I have another presentation about history and nutrition where I go more in depth of this, and I absolutely love it. So we're going to scratch the surface here, but really focusing on the words that are bouncing off the screen at you that have something to do with our communication style about food. So we've got the oldest document in the world looking at diabetes. It's been around for a long time. Fast forward, 1797, Dr. John Rollo was a military surgeon. He worked with two people with type 1 diabetes that were sailors like him. And what he found that what he needed to do to help them was they had to drop vegetable starch. Fiber was the problem from his perspective. Eat more animal fat and protein to induce anorexia. There's a lot more to talk about with Dr. Rollo, but not in this presentation. 1800s, new developments. Look at what we're studying now. Glucose, glycogen, carbohydrate, metabolism is linked to diabetes. And then in the 1910s, there's another starvation that jumps out here, Frederick Allen's diet. Restrict calories and carbs until death. It was a tough life with type 1 diabetes in the beginning, not being able to hold your nutrition and not knowing what to do with it. So it was a tough decision to make as to what would help people with diabetes survive just a little bit longer. Insulin is discovered. Let's bump ahead a bit more. 1920-21, carbohydrate restriction continues. Now, after the development of pharmacologic treatments, interest in dietary modifications diminished. So this was at a standstill. Carbohydrate restriction stayed right where it was, even though we now have insulin to help us survive. We're not looking at nutrition anymore just because we have insulin. In the 1930s, we saw the line system evolve into the exchange system. Not only were we already talking about dropping carbohydrates, but now we're encouraging more of a higher intake of meat, cheese, and eggs to have that euglycemic reaction. The insulin at the time wasn't nearly as good as what we've got now. So clearly there is a lot to look into as to how this evolution started. Food manufacturing taglines. Sugar substitutes and use of the word diabetic as a label and marketing tool. Now, use of the word diabetic really came from Dr. Rollo, but the food business got a hold of this and began to market with that word that we no longer want to use to label people with. And data to diet culture. So World War II, post-war, this is when we started to get more data about chronic care. To people with type 1 diabetes, we're back to barely surviving at this point. There was something like black market insulin going on, food rationing in war-torn countries. This was less than 1,000 calories a day. I encourage you to look at research. This paper by Mink is fantastic. If you're into this kind of information, you'll start reading it and you will be reading for the rest of the day. France in particular has a really intense history of what happened to nutrition for the whole country post-World War II, but people with type 1 diabetes were struggling. Nutrient deprivation led to lifelong trauma, and that then increased risk of poor long-term health outcomes, where we then saw an increase in type 2 diabetes related to people that were restricting nutrition because of the war. Let's bump ahead. 1960s. Concerns were raised about the risks of a low-carb, high-fat diet because of all of the other concerns that we have as a relation to cardiovascular health with diabetes. Studies revealed that higher carb diets in Asia and Africa decreased cardiovascular complications. 1970s, strict meal plans include weighing and measuring food, sugar restriction, low to moderate carbohydrate control. And in 1972, the Atkins diet shows up. Total carbohydrate intake that was increased below 20%. This was classically ketogenic in clinical studies. So even though the research is coming out to question the way that we've been treating type 1 diabetes because of the other complications that we are now concerned about, here we have Atkins coming forward to say, no, continue to restrict nutrients, continue doing it the exact same way that we have been talking about in diabetes. In 1980s and 90s, new guidelines were published in the US and UK, but they weren't exactly met with open arms because they encouraged people with diabetes to reduce fat intake, increase carbohydrates, mostly complex carbs. Now we're looking at total health, not just glucose management 100% of the time. A nutrition plan and insulin regimen should consider individual lifestyle. This is huge, but what was the approach to nutrition education when the new recommendations came out? They were standardized. Uniform instructions lacking individualization. It really looked like, how do we help and treat the most people with the least amount of time? And also the food pyramid in 1992. And I do want to share that in my own experience, even looking at the food pyramid today is a little bit traumatic for me, because I remember what that felt like as someone trying to control everything I ate when I was only 12, 13, 14 years old. It sticks with us when we have these difficult experiences. And in the 2000s, guidelines stress the need to avoid excessive animal protein and salt. Completely different than what we were looking at for many, many years, and still what exists today in the world of dieting. Sufficient in fruit and vegetables, my plate, the Harvard Health Plate in 2011, we are looking at a primarily plant-based nutrition plan today. And it's actually been around, and those recommendations have been strong for years and years and years, but it hasn't quite been embraced in a process of treating the whole person. Diet culture, it fuels carb phobia, promoting restriction, obsession, size, and anxiety about body weight. And so thinking from the beginning, the relationship between diabetes and carbs is complicated when this happens. The word control, or just even the thought, the method of controlling low carb emphasis at diagnosis is not easy for people to adopt, leading into avoidance and resentment towards foods that raise blood glucose. So some dangerous habits can come forward from that. Quick fix seeking, negative thoughts towards food. Think now, that emotional depth of diabetes and how it can take all that mind, body, spirit, all the time thinking about these things. And then we've got social media just hammering it that much harder. This idea of perfection. What social media targets is our insecurities so that we can spend money on the programs that they're promoting. It's a very dangerous and delicate position for someone with diabetes to be influenced by. So you can see how emotional health is underneath all of this. Glucose management, nutrition, exercise, the way that we think and feel about ourselves, the technology. So if we don't address emotional health, we are missing something, because it's there. It always will be there. Overwhelming diet research. I do want to bring this up because there's a lot out there. It's coming fast. It's coming hard, faster than we as diabetes care and education specialists can read it. And I think this is how to stress people with diabetes out, particularly if you just speak with them as to how they feel like they should know everything. Sometimes this comes up, or that they're missing something, even though they try to keep up with all the research. It is almost impossible to keep up with everything. I think this is also how to stress a dietitian out, if I might say. Look at our word bank, our diet bank here. High fat, high protein, low carb, all of these things going on. I threw intuitive eating into here because it's really buzzing, intuitive eating right now. We're talking about it a lot. Study from Kumar. This is really great. This is worth reading, particularly if you are looking at this from all angles. The nutrition recommendations that have been around for a long time, but you're considering starting to change your method and your communication style related to food. There is no consensus on the amount of carbohydrates permitted, low carb, very low carb. Finding that A1C reduction in 3 to 6 months, there was no glycemic advantage at 12 and 24 months of really severely restricting carbohydrates. And that high-fat diets are not conducive to long-term preventive health, which we've got to be really focused on here. People with diabetes are living longer. There's a lot of people out there that are now reaching into their 30, 40, 50th year of having type 1 diabetes, and they've been highly aware of these nutrition recommendations. They've been growing up with them. Not to mention people with type 2 diabetes that are diagnosed older in life. Historically, people with diabetes became either non-compliant or compliant, adherent or non-adherent, negative language to nutrition interventions. So time to think about our language. Here's a question as well. Meeting nutrient needs for people with diabetes, ? Whatever happened to just daily recommended intakes? Meeting our nutrient needs versus being in this diet bank and thinking we have to restrict things all the time. We could eat to treat the whole person by just looking at our nutritional needs and making sure that we fulfill them primarily. Nutrition and mindset. Okay, here we go. Jane, 57. I cannot wait to introduce this to you. Jane is diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, among other conditions that many of us are quite familiar with and see in partnership with type 2. The referral to me about Jane had a lot to do with trying to help her with pain management with food. It's an anti-inflammatory diet for arthritis, but also I knew what we could do with this in order to increase her insulin sensitivity. She was ready. Jane was irritated. She's a hard worker. She wanted to feel better, frustrating history with healthcare practitioners. And what really got me in the heart about Jane is her history of being a hard worker. She blamed herself for having these chronic conditions because she thought that her goals of trying to become a very successful woman had something to do with it. She was so focused on her career and the autopilot that it had her on for so long that it led to these conditions. So she really beat herself up over that. What she told me was, I asked my doctor about juicing and they laughed at me. They only wanted me on medications and I got depressed. I don't want to be fat, Grandma. So the emotions came out right away with specific questions that I had asked to try to get a little deeper into what Jane was looking for and what we could do about it. Her challenges were worry, self-doubt from situations like this. She asked for help. She wanted to learn more about nutrition. And she was encouraged to restrict carbohydrates further. She lacked self-love. She was so unhappy from this history. She wanted to change it, felt like there was nothing else that she could do because of what she'd experienced so far. She told me she'd tried everything with dieting. She'd been there, done all the things. And the physical pain that was so demoralizing for her caused her to not exercise, even though she really wanted to. She loved movement, but she didn't like to wake up and hurt. It's the action plan. Jane was going to hop on a CGM. It was time to get her to see what was going on in her body with blood glucose. At the same time, we were going to transition to an anti-inflammatory diet looking at whole foods, plant-based. Increase those fiber-rich foods. Let's start eating to treat Jane. Let's really target all of these conditions at one time to treat the whole person. She was fully on board. We called this Operation Fit Grandma, to heal your relationship with your body and food. This was optimistic coaching, and I'm going to talk more about how we put this together, is to use communication style, words, and language as incredible encouragement to put a story together to help someone reach their goals, to see, to visualize who they can be and not who they're not. Shifting Jane's perspective, this is where diabetes care and education specialists, no matter your background, dietitian, nurse practitioners, pharmacists, all of us as a care team can do something to help fast forward and adjust someone's stagnant position in history into this positive mindset. Here's what Jane was telling me. I don't want this. I can't get this right. No one's taking me seriously. And then eating for punishment. She was ready, but she wasn't sure how to do this because she'd had such a tough experience and nothing works. She needed a team so much and she needed tools. So we shifted into self-talk. How you talk about yourself matters. I hear you. Tell me more. The visual exercises of remember who you are. You're a tough gal. Let's find that person again. Let's find Jane, and we're going to relate to your health, to who you really are. And think about food as nourishment. Food is the solution. It's not the problem here, but self-love is going to be a part of that. We got to eat like you love yourself now, Jane. Regularly check into, we got to be in touch. Your whole care team wants to know how you are, and we're here to support you. And that CGM, it gave her proof of her effort. So she really enjoyed seeing that, wow, my nutrition is working here because my glucose is starting to change. So here's that recycling image. Personal experience, she's heard. Rational interpretation of data, looking at glucose values and making smart and strategic decisions with that related to nutrition. And that also addressed her emotional health, which was underlying all of this. I'm going to go into applying person-centered language before I give you the outcomes of Jane. I'm going to kind of leave you in anticipation here. Helping you to think about what can you do in this condition where we shifted perspective is to listen for negative self-talk, to intervene. So distress, anxiety, I was hearing all these shoulds from her, perfectionism. These are familiar territory, I'm sure, for so many of us that work with people that have any chronic condition. But what is optimistic coaching? It builds upon the trust, that conversation that we're having to target something deeper, individualized advice. I'm building upon her strengths. I'm trying to find everything I can to help her believe in herself. And it really is challenging to us to do this. It's emotional for us just as much, but it helps us become better communicators. And also the holistic picture of there's so much more that we're treating here than just glucose values. The strategy with optimistic coaching, it looks beyond. We're targeting emotions and personal experience. We're really getting in there, challenging in a way that we think as well. So it inspires people to take personal responsibility as we identify those goals and they prioritize their values. I mean, look at the collaborative care of this. If it's therapy, our providers, all of us working together to watch someone unfold in such a positive light. And from the patient's perspective, look at how those words and thoughts inspire action. Pain is her catalyst for change for so many of us, transforming that fear into wisdom. Tyler's story. She's rewriting her internal dialogue by building her personal power, remembering who she is, determining your experience with positive self-talk. Huge shift in every which way when it comes to chronic care. We are treating so much at the same time with just our thinking. Here are the outcomes for Dane in 5 months. Letting you absorb this because I'm so excited about how her A1C is coming into range. Here she's losing weight, cardiovascular improvement, which is helping her exercise more. And I actually had to slow her down because she wanted to exercise too much at that point, that she had to learn moderation because she was so excited about it. She made me cry. She called me her angel. That was just deep stuff with her. But this is what happens when people feel heard for the first time in 25 years. It was major, and the CGM had so much to do with it. So treating this emotional health, looking at what she's worried about, her self-doubt, building self-love, and focusing on these things. Her history of food restriction and pain, and her awareness of the conditions themselves, that treated the physical problem. It treated the clinical observation, is really focusing on that depth of emotion and how that impacted everything else when it comes to embracing the challenge that you have and then using it to move forward into a much happier and healthier place. Words are powerful. Even in the face of anger, fear, loss of control, we keep going. Here's a fun story I want to show you here about Elaine, 41. She's one of my best friends. As I started to dig into what her experience was like, she had doctor-induced mom guilt with her second pregnancy. She's a runner, hiker. She is the ultimate go-getter, powerful person who is super, super driven. It's hard to slow her down. So when I find out that she's feeling shamed for her A1C values during her second pregnancy, it broke my heart. She's very routine with nutrition and exercise. She knew that this was something she had to keep up with, not just during her pregnancy, but it's how she manages as being this super busy person in her work ethic. And what happened within that exam room is she was accused of not trying hard enough and putting her baby at risk. For someone with her mentality, this was shocking and really hurtful. And she felt that there was a lack of clinical guidance in every way during her pregnancy as to what to do, if it did even relate to her nutrition that she was so good with, but then with insulin management during the pregnancy. She had said, I just wanted to scream and cry because I felt like I couldn't win. For all the things that she had known about type 1 since she was 5, she was at a loss. So what she did is used her emotions as a resource. Elaine says, I was lectured and I was furious. All of that rage had a good purpose. I kept running, tracking, and making adjustments. I let the rage out on long runs and completed a half marathon at 8 months pregnant. Elaine's amazing. This was tapping into her emotional health from a place of pain and trying to see the light, a big blinking light. So you can imagine, as a diabetes education specialist, when you have patients who may be pregnant or going through something difficult and they're hearing something that's causing that place to be even more difficult, or if we can get to the root of that, we can help someone get there. We can shift the words, shift that perspective into helping that person believe in themselves a bit more to get to the solution rather than sit in that place of pain without going anywhere. Elaine was that kind of person. She knew exactly what she needed to do to move forward. So this was emotional health coming to the surface and forging ahead. Modernizing nutrition language. Here's going to come to the conclusion with what we're going to talk about is restricting eating fear-based. Look at the consequences of restrictive eating. We've kind of made a full range of understanding this with the emotional health, preoccupation with food and dieting, even nutrient deficiencies. It can increase insulin resistance, eating a lot of fat, a lot of animal protein. In the short term, it looks like one thing. In the long term, it looks like insulin resistance. Those obsessive thoughts, perfectionism, If we're looking at the consequences of restrictive eating, we can solve the historical problem. Distinguishing carbohydrates correctly resolves the idea that carbs are bad. We can change that language, or that portions must be cut drastically lower than a person with diabetes' individual carbohydrate needs. Same nutrient, but different. Here's just a snapshot. Sweet potatoes and black beans, they've been around for thousands of years. Glazed donuts and nacho cheese chips show up and they start getting grouped as carbohydrates. But look at this. Half of these junk foods are fat. They're not specifically carbohydrates alone. They have no fiber. They're junk food. And so if the language is cut carbs, the idea here is cut them all. And vegetables, legumes, fruits, potatoes, really healthy foods that decrease inflammation in the body and help us thrive cardiovascularly, they are carbohydrates. So if we shift our language into helping patients realize that there's junk food and then there's fiber-rich carbohydrates, we can incredibly change someone's perspective and perception on what healthy food is and how to treat it. Positive food vocabulary. Here's the language. Solution-focused food vocabulary. This was a big deal with Jane. Nourishing, healing. This also had a lot to do with Elaine and Tyler, that healing idea, thinking long-term, and the abundance of plant-based foods. Increasing short-chain fatty acids. These are where the foods are. It's anti-inflammatory. It's immune boosting. So we are constantly in a place to treat holistically the whole system. We have positive research that shows that short-chain fatty acids are incredibly impactful positively in brain health, digestion, kidney, mental, endocrine support, and the increased quality of life with mental health. So if we talk about food differently, particularly carbohydrates, in a solutions-focused vocabulary, it could change the course of every individual's outlook on food. And that will have a ripple effect incredibly, globally. Reframing carbohydrates. What does eat low carbs say to someone? It says high protein. And what happens is they eat more saturated fat as a result. It tends to be undefined and unclear in portions. It excludes individualized nutrient needs by just saying, eat low carb, eat more protein, you're fine, see you in 3 months. We've got to get more specific than that, because eat more protein ends up increasing meat, eggs, and dairy. There are no short-chain fatty acids in these foods. We're looking at backtracking into history by doing that as well. And increasing cardiovascular risk, increases those inflammatory foods. We're looking at other conditions like pain or even gout. Protein is individually based also. Age, activity level, desired body weight. There are a lot of people with diabetes out there that are under the impression that they can eat as much protein as they want because it does not raise glucose values, and that is incredibly incorrect. So that is language that we can change to inspire self-care and a completely different outlook about food. What does eat more plants say, or eat more fiber? Addition rather than subtraction. We're focusing on what you're not getting versus what you are as the problem. Eat more of this to treat. Focus on quality and color, variety and nutritional value. It's energetic nourishment. Food is supposed to be fun. It's supposed to make us feel good, not bad or guilty about who we are. And biodiversity for preventive health. Such a big deal. Incredible research going on today with biodiversity and the microbiome, something really worth looking at and how that can treat the whole person and treat diabetes as a result. So inspiring self-care with our words, awareness of emotional health. It can help us sharpen our communication skills. We as a diabetes care and education specialists, we have just, awesome skills to begin with. I am so proud to be one of us and acknowledging the great impact diabetes has on emotional health. This can be our role. Pivot the educational protocol to address those immediate needs as we see them. Optimistic coaching comes in. Question diet culture and how it may cause harm to your patients. When you see it, address it. Engage in optimistic coaching to support self-efficacy and quality of life. We can make that impact by the questions we ask. Use positive food vocabulary to modernize carbohydrate knowledge. Let's lift it. Let's really elevate how we work with food, getting out of that diet mentality and into something solutions and healthy and fun. Lead with a positive attitude. People with diabetes have it in them to be exceptional. I've seen it, and if I wasn't my own experiment, I wouldn't be able to talk about it like I do with such passion. So there's the personal experience, the rational interpretation, and emotional health, all working together to see life with diabetes in a completely different light, using our communication skills effectively and positively to move forward in our profession. Thank you. Thank you so much today. Please reach out and ask me questions. I'd love to hear your comments, and I really hope you enjoyed this conversation and presentation. Have a great week.